I'd like to talk to you about the United States of America. The U.S., the States, America. Whatever you call it, you likely conjure up certain images, such as the American flag, the bald eagle, baseball perhaps. Maybe you consider a nation divided, or something ugly, possibly inspiring. But how about poetic? Did you know that today you could turn to Joy Harjo for poetic inspiration, and in doing so, she would be fulfilling her duty as United States Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry? It's true. Take, for example, this section from her poem titled Remember.
Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father, he is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth.
The idea to have a poetry consultant came about in 1936, and it was funded by the author Archer H. Huntington. A consultant in poetry, or as it's now known, Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, is a position appointed by the Library of Congress. The appointee acts as a poetry chairperson and is expected to attend certain events and produce one major work while appointed. There have been 30 consultants in poetry prior to 1985, when the title was changed to United States Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. After which, there were 23, Joy Harjo being the current. There is a full and comprehensive list of all of the poet laureates and consultants of poetry at Britannica.com, and that is where I got all of my information for this video. Since there is such a voluminous number of subjects, I'm only going to focus on some notable appointees.
Joseph Auslander was the first United States consultant in poetry and was appointed in 1937.
Auslander's work often focused on war, and at one point his poetry was used to sell United States war bonds. His collection The Unconquerables, published in 1943, centered on Nazi-occupied countries, and is of particular acclaim.
Louise Bogan, appointed in 1945, would be the first woman to serve as chair of poetry.
This is Bogan's poem, Epitaph for a Romantic Woman. She has attained the permanence she dreamed of, where old stones lie sunning. Untended stalks blow over her, even and swift, like young men running. Always in the heart she loves, others had lived, she heard their laughter. She lies where none has lain before, where certainly none will follow after. One poet, appointed consultant in 1952, is particularly interesting in that while he was appointed, due to poor health he wasn't able to serve. And furthermore, amongst the anti-communist hysteria of the time, his title was ultimately revoked for fear he was a communist sympathizer.
William Carlos Williams was born September 17, 1883, in Rutherford, New Jersey.
Williams received his Doctor of Medicine from the University of Pennsylvania in 1906. And by 1910, he had returned to Rutherford and dedicated his life to poetry and the practice of medicine. Two poets, Robert Penn Warren and Howard Nemerov, served as consultants in poetry, and then again, when the title was changed, serving as Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry.
Robert Penn Warren was appointed as the third consultant in poetry from 1944 to 1945. Then he was appointed as the first Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry from 1986 to 1987.
Some other things Warren did twice was to win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1947, then a Pulitzer Prize for poetry in 1958. But he went on to win a second Pulitzer Prize in poetry again in 1979.
Howard Nemerov served as consultant in poetry from 1963 to 1964. He served as Poet Laureate from 1988 to 1990.
The distinction of Warren and Nemerov to have served as both consultant in poetry and Poet Laureate, it is not at all uncommon in either title for poets to serve 2 consecutive terms.
When Rita Frances Dove was appointed Poet Laureate in 1993, she was not only the first African American to hold the chair,
She was the youngest person to have ever taken the position. As recently as 2018, Dove was appointed editor of poetry for iconic The New York Times Magazine.
This is Dove's poem, The First Book. Open it. Go ahead, it won't bite. Well, maybe a little. More a nip-like. A tingle. It's pleasurable, really. You see, it keeps on opening. You may fall in. Sure, it's hard to get started. Remember learning to use knife and fork? Dig in. You'll never reach the bottom. It's not like it's the end of the world, just the world as you think you know it.
Tracy K. Smith served as Poet Laureate from 2017 to 2019. She is Professor of Creative Writing at Princeton University and Chair of the Lewis Center of the Arts. Professor Smith is special in that she is the only Poet Laureate or consultant in poetry that I have ever had the pleasure of meeting. At the Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut, on July 11, 2018, I participated in a workshop offered by Professor Smith and the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival, which is held annually at the museum. The workshop was a turning point for me, and my interest in poetry, my writing of poetry, my reading of poetry, my appreciation for poetry. This is my notebook. It's a lot of chicken scratch, but I wrote down the names of poets that Professor Smith talked about, provided poems from, referenced or recommended. Ruthie Carr, Billy Collins, Matthew Dickman, Natalie Diaz, Elizabeth Bishop, Mark Doty. The Sunken Garden Poetry Festival is held every summer at the Hillstead Museum. It is a wonderful place to immerse yourself in poetry, to experience poetry, meet poets, and have a wonderfully creative, growth-promoting experience. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I've only touched upon a small number of the poets who served as consultants in poetry and poet laureates. I invite you to examine and explore, to appreciate this often neglected sector of our nation's government. In conclusion, this poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, first African-American poet to win the Pulitzer Prize. We real cool. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon.